My name's Freeman. I work at University College London and at Microsoft Research, and I'm going to talk to you about something a little bit different today, which is about the work we've been trying to do on understanding the movement and behaviour of animals in the wild. Most of what I'm going to talk about is about birds, seabirds, but you can imagine these same techniques being applied to a variety of animals: lions, tigers, whales, seals, all sorts of stuff. It's the same techniques, the same technology that we would use. So throughout the talk, I'll go into why we want to study birds, why we think that's interesting, but also throughout the talk I'll give examples of why computing is fundamental to what we do. And I think I did my undergraduate and then my Doctor of Philosophy in computing, and I think that has enabled me to do the kind of work that you see on the TV. So the kind of thing you see on Frozen Planet. I go out into the wild, I find animals, I put devices on them, I learn about their behaviour and where they go, and I think that's fascinating to me. And I'll show you some of the stuff that these techniques that we've been developing can do. So, why birds? Why are they interesting? So, principally because we just don't know enough about them. We know stuff about when they're in your garden, when you see them on the beach, on the cliff, but we don't know enough about when we don't see them. So they go off to find food, they forage for their chicks, they go and they find other animals to breed with, and they migrate. So lots of animals move throughout the year where they live, and that's called migration. We just don't understand a lot about why those things occur, why they might change, or how the animals do it. And most importantly, we don't understand what happens when the environment changes and how it will affect these animals. So as an example of that, this is the only graph I'll show you, but this is the number of chicks that a pair of birds will have over the last 20 years. And so it's an average, so if every pair has a chick, the line should be up at 1, and if two pairs, one chick in those two pairs fails, the line would be at 0.5, and if only one chick per 5 pairs, it would be down to 0.2. And you can see that over the last 20 years, for these two species of UK birds, guillemots and kittiwakes, this is declining quickly. So when I was at school, about the same age as you back here, these birds, every pair was having about a chick. But now, a few years ago, it takes about 5 or 6 pairs to have a chick. And who knows what's going to happen over here. And if this gets to 0, these species are extinct. And we don't know enough about why this is happening. And that's why we're doing the work we're doing. So how do people gather this data? They go out into the wild. There's a very happy person here with a pair of binoculars, staring at birds. And they find birds and other animals in the wild, and they put tags on them. And these tags are like bracelets with a unique identity on them. That means if you find that bird or that animal again, you can tell who it is. And you know that animal survived. And people do this all over the UK, all over the world, and they get data a bit like this. So this is birds tagged in the UK, found in other places in the world. So there's about 3 different species, 3 different types of animal here. Some Manx shearwaters in brown, where's my thing? Here, which have gone down to the coast of Brazil, of South America. These were tagged in the UK originally, but the bodies were found here. They're usually dead ones because they're easy to find. Swallows that have come down to South Africa, and then I think these are fieldfare. It's kind of thrush, small bird, found throughout Northern Europe. And what's lovely about this data is we get an idea of where these birds go and where they might be going in the winter or outside of the breeding season. But we don't know how they get there or why they go there. And so what we've been trying to do is to use some computational devices, little trackers we call them, to understand the movement of these birds. So this is 3 different devices, and I'll talk about them from right to left. But here's when we put them on a bird in the wild. So we go out to an island off the coast of Wales. We catch birds. This is a Manx shearwater. It's a little bit smaller than a pigeon. And we put these devices on them to record their position over time. So this GPS logger here is just like the GPS you might have on your phone. So every second or so, it can tell where the bird is, and it writes it down in its own memory. So this device remembers where the bird is going very accurately. This is a depth recorder. So we put that on the tail of the bird. And that lets us understand when the bird dives and how deeply it dives. And that tells us something about when the bird's fishing for food on the ocean. And lastly, which I'll talk about in a little bit, is what we call a geolocator. And all that does is it measures light. But that light lets you work out where you are on Earth. And I'll tell you about that in a second. What's lovely about this device, which we put on a bird's leg on a little ring, is that it's amazingly light. So 2 grams is less than half of a teaspoon of water, which lets you understand where these birds go for years. So the problem with all of these devices is that we have to catch the birds. So when I first started this work, my boss said to me, let's go out, let's catch birds, let's go to New Zealand, that'll be great. And I was thinking, Lord of the Rings, mountains, sky, wonderful. Actually, it's a lot of sitting in the dark. So here's me sitting for 9 hours in a freezing cold rainstorm, waiting for one bird to come back so I could get the device back off them. Because these just log data. They don't transmit it, they don't send it, they just log. But what that lets you get is remarkably detailed information. Oh, actually, so this is the sound that I was hearing when I was sitting out there. So I'm sitting in the dark with this sound spookily coming to me through the darkness. This is the clacking of the black petrel. And they sit on a little lump and call for other birds to come and mate with them. So I'm sitting there for 9 hours listening to this sound, going slightly insane, just to get that device. But that device gives you really rich, detailed information about the movements of these animals. And I'll talk through these in turn. So here is some of the work we do on homing pigeons, the kind of pigeons you see around the streets and stuff, but usually they're trained to home, to come back to a given location. So if we release them from, say, 5 kilometers from home, they'll fly home very well. And what we look at is the behavior they take during this release. So all these kind of dynamic soaring tracks and stuff lets us understand how they navigate through space and how they interact with each other. So this is a Manx shearwater. This is a 5-day foraging trip. So it left the coast of Wales, went out for 5 days to find food for its chick, and overlaid on this track, just sampled about every 5 minutes, is diving events. So we know that it's diving for food. And then here is a horrendously complicated diagram of all of the tracks we've gathered from Manx shearwaters for the last 5 years. Now, to you that might look silly, complicated, but to us this is a wealth of behavioral data. And this is what we use to try and understand the behavior of the animals. And we use computational methods, which I won't go into, but basically we try and kind of decompose, deconstruct, look at the states or the behaviors in that data. So we try and use all the rich behavior we get, not just to talk about position, but to talk about behavior. So here we've overlaid our prediction, what we assume the bird is doing, given the data we have, about flight, foraging, and rest. And this gives us a much better idea about where they go, why they go there, and how important these areas are while they forage. So, as a brief aside, how do birds navigate? So hands up if you think you know how a bird navigates. Anyone? No idea? Here's one. Say it out louder. Using its eyes. Anyone else? Here. Instinct? What do you mean by instinct? Just it knows where to go. Okay. Anyone else? Migrate? Memory. That's a good idea. Yeah. So this is a lot of scientists try and study these things, and there's a lot of different hypotheses. As you see, there's 3 just in a few samples there about how they do it. So here's a pigeon, and people have this idea that they use a map and compass. So they have some map in their head of the distribution of things around space that they can remember, and they use a compass like the sun, like they know where the sun is in the sky, so they can work out the direction to work out how to get home. But what is this map? So some people think it's magnetic fields. So over the whole of the globe of the Earth, there's different variations in the magnetic field of the Earth that the birds might use to get home. Other people think it's vision. So this is that the birds can see the landmarks around where they are and use those landmarks to get home. But for homing pigeons, you can release them hundreds of kilometers from where they've been before, and they'll get home reliably. We don't really understand how they do that. It turns out the most likely explanation is they smell how to get home. So if you take a bird and you release it far from home, but you anesthetize, you disrupt, you get rid of its smell, they can't get home. But if you leave it, they can get home. So what scientists think is that a lot of these birds are smelling the distribution of chemicals around where they live to get home. But in reality, they use all of these systems. They use a sort of complex collection of magnetism, of sight, of smell to get home. And what we're trying to do is to work out how these things work together. But as I said, it's kind of surprising to us that smell seems to be the most important. You can imagine trying to smell your way home. Unless you had a good sort of kebab shop next to your house, you'd be quite stuck, I think. But what we've been doing most recently is trying to use the social structure of the flight, how the birds interact with one another, to understand how they navigate as a group. So this is, I think, 5 or 6 homing pigeons flying through Oxfordshire, and you can see that a small group of them seem to know exactly what they're doing and they're heading home. But this bird at the back, is it following them? Is it doing its own thing? We don't really know. So we're beginning to look at the relationship between these birds and how that changes the way they navigate. And we've actually been developing some devices that you can put on these birds that'll allow the data to be sent between birds. So if each of these birds has a phone on it, so to speak, it will be sending messages to every other bird, so that when we get one of them back, we'll get all of the information from that flock. And we think that's quite exciting. So rather than just how to get home near where you live, like homing pigeons do, migration's a much, much greater distance. So birds, twice a year, like the Manx shearwater, they go from where they live in the summer to some other wintering distribution, some other wintering location. And often that's a really long distance. So the Manx shearwater is a British bird. It goes down to South America in winter, which is about 10,000 kilometers away. And it does this every year. And what we use to look at this is what I call geolocation, which is this little 2-gram device, this half a teaspoon of water device. And all this device does is measure light. So every 10 minutes it measures the maximum light level. And what that lets you do is work out when the sun comes up and when the sun goes down, and therefore work out the length of the day. And if you think about it, where you are on Earth changes how long a day is. So if you can record the length of a day, you can work out the position of this animal on the Earth. So all this device does, this tiny device, is record day length, and it lets us get data like this. So this is a group of Manx shearwaters moving from the UK down to the coast of Argentina, and then migrating back up through the North Atlantic to the UK. And you can see some interesting things in this, which is that if we overlay it with sea surface temperature, it looks like this kind of light blue region seems to be the best place for them to be. And we can also look at that data on what scientists call chlorophyll data. So this is a satellite up in space that measures the color of the Earth. And it uses that color to look at how much plant life there is at given locations of the Earth. And what you can see is that these birds seem to go to these hotspots, these locations where there's lots of plant life in the ocean. And the reason for that is that the plants get eaten by plankton, the plankton gets eaten by fish, and the birds eat the fish. And so we can use this kind of satellite data to begin to ask questions about why these birds go where they go. And if we can determine why they go where they go, we can suggest to people, to nations, to countries, why they should protect these places, because we don't want these birds to die away. Another bird we look at is puffins, that you might know about. Cute little things. And actually, we started working on puffins because we just didn't know where they went in the winter. Nobody knew. They left the UK. People found them the next year. And what we find is actually, so this is a bit of a fiddly diagram, that from the UK, they kind of go everywhere. But actually, within that going everywhere, it looks like there's a kind of pattern. So they go out to the west in August, they go up to the north in October, and down to the south in February, sometimes as far around as the Med. And they're not flying across land, they're going around into the Mediterranean. And we thought this was interesting. They kind of go everywhere, that's sort of interesting. But if you look at an individual, one bird, that we've tracked for 2 successive years, 2 years in a row, it does exactly the same thing. And we have no idea how they do that. So this bird here goes out and goes to the same places 2 years in a row, as does this bird. And 2 birds that might live right next to each other, a few feet apart, go to different places, but they do the same thing time and time again. And we just don't understand how they can do that. Do they memorize, like someone said, the routes they take? Do they have resources or landmarks that they follow? And what's surprising is that if you look at puffins, this is time-lapse, lots of photos of the puffins in their colony. They live within a few feet of one another. They come back every year to this tiny burrow, and then they go off on their migration at the end of the summer, and they go to the same place every time, 20, 30 years in a row. But their neighbor does something totally different. And that fascinates me, that we just don't understand enough about their behavior or how they navigate to be able to determine why they do this. So, throughout what I've described to you, we've collected data using tiny computers. We've looked at that data using a computational system to look at maps. We analyze that data using computers. And in fact, on every animal I show you, a tiny computer is recording its behavior. And I think that's kind of fundamental to the work that's going on in behavior and ecology, is using computers, computational techniques, computational devices to understand our world better. So what might we do next? People talk about tracking animals for their entire life. So you might, when an animal's born, put a device on it, and when you see that animal again 50 years from now, you'd know everything it did between born and now, and that would let us get a great picture for how these animals behave. We might look at social networks in animals, because as diseases spread between people, they spread between animals too. And understanding things like avian flu and the spread of that is really important both for our health and for the health of the animals. Most interestingly, as I've mentioned, is trying to understand whether these animals will survive or go extinct. And I think that that's partly up to you guys. So each of you are about to decide what to do, And you can use the things you learn to be able to learn more about our world to stop these kind of animals becoming extinct. And I think that's important. So, thanks.